Hey, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. First thing Saturday morning. I really appreciate having you here. So I'm going to talk about my work in Nepal, but actually it's based on a much more sort of theoretical foundation, which is a bit more general than just to Nepal. I'll introduce that as it goes. Okay. All righty. So I'll talk about the intergenerational transmission of trauma as it affects depression, potential causes, mechanisms, as it were. Okay. What do we actually know about polyvictimization, which I'll define, don't worry. This new theory that I published last year, particularly the claims about non-additivity, subjectivity, and conceptual insufficiency. Okay. And the topology that it generates, which is about, we're talking about victimization here. And so the topology is basically making a claim that rather than focusing severely on, sort of completely on, well, how many times were you punched in the last year, which is what, a lot of people do. How many times were you kicked, bitten, hit? What we need to look at is the invasiveness of the victimization. We need to look at the exploitativeness of the victimization, and then also the severity, which is what we already look at. Okay, I'll talk about why we do this in Nepal. Okay, the methods of the study, which is a nationally representative sample of roughly 1,100 mothers and their adolescent children. Okay, the results and a bit of discussion and conclusion, and let me hope that I can get this done in the time allotted. Okay, so. Depression affects about 300 million people globally, and it's associated with early death via suicide in Nepal as well. And about 1 in every 6 15 to 17-year-olds in low to middle income countries have made suicide attempts, according to Clifton et al. Okay? Extensive research suggests that traumatic victimization in generation 1, that is the parents' generation, may be a cause of depression in generation 2, even when generation 2 is not exposed. And as you might imagine, a lot of this literature originally came out of work on the Holocaust. Okay. And okay, where am I aiming this? Okay. So why might generation 1 trauma affect generation 2 depression? Be important to understand. There's some arguments that there are epigenetic effects on DNA function or gene transcription. Okay. There are arguments about complex PTSD. You're probably familiar with regular post-traumatic stress disorder. Complex PTSD tends to come out of long-term exposure to severe violence and victimization, and it has, just to be simple about it, stickier effects, okay, that are harder to get rid of. All right. It could be, and this makes sense, via parenting and particularly parent maltreatment of offspring. Okay. Or it could be, which is what I'm arguing here, that the unique effects of multiple victimizations, that is to say, polyvictimization, when we talk about multiple types of victimization, we mean polyvictimization, on parents' self-concept that transmit to children. Okay. And just to give you the nutshell of the argument, the cognitive model of depression argues that a major cause is negative self-concept, in which the self is seen as deficient, worthless, inadequate, unlovable. So the argument here is if a mother's subjective self-concept is pervaded by a sense of being flawed, by invasive and exploitative chronic traumatic victimization, theory and research on self-concept suggests that children may inherit the sense of being systematically flawed. Okay. All right. So what are we talking about here? There's this whole burgeoning literature in my field on polyvictimization, okay, which is like, okay, as a child, you were sexually abused and you were neglected, or as a child, you were physically abused and you were emotionally abused, like this. Okay. It's developed by Finkelhor, and it's defined by multiple types of violent victimization and abuse, including neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and exposure to IPV or other types of violence. All right, neighborhood violence, for example, but most of the focus is on child maltreatment. Okay. And there's a lot of literature that this is associated with depression, suicidal ideation, a lot of bad stuff, post-traumatic stress disorder, sorry for the acronyms without the parentheses, low self-esteem, substance abuse, delinquency, mental health problems. Okay. It's bad, in other words. All right. And if you're looking at low to middle income countries, about almost half, right? A bit more than 1 in 3, and between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 out of 10 are poly victims. Okay. If you're looking at China, about 14 or 1 in 6, 14% of Chinese people are poly victims in their lifetime. Finkelhor et al. Argue that this has lasting impacts on children, and it's not really surprising. I mean, we've been looking at abuse of children since the 70s, at least, okay? But it bugs me a bit, okay? So in addition to being a theorist and all this other stuff, I'm a statistician, right? So why would you look at multiple types of victimization, okay? From a research perspective, if you could simply add up the effects, right? If neglect on top of physical abuse is worse, well, I could look at it by studying the combined effects. Okay, that's good. But I could also just look at 2 separate studies of neglect and physical abuse and say, well, here's the coefficient for neglect. Here's the coefficient for physical abuse. Let's add them. Okay, now we know the combined effect. Okay. So what we argue in this theory paper is that the theorization of polyvictimization is inadequate. And it doesn't really contribute that much to knowledge, the way that it's conceptualized. Right? And that's the paper. This is like my marketing campaign. Okay. So the first thing that we say is a meaningful polyvictimization concept has to predict non-additivity. Okay. It means if I can just look at neglect and sexual abuse, and when I look at the combined effects, it's the same as adding 2 coefficients from the main effects, I haven't done anything. I don't need a concept of polyvictimization. If I want to know the combined effects, I can just take the 2 coefficients from neglect and sexual abuse and add them. Okay? We don't need it. We already know the effects from single victimization studies. Right? There's a lot of research in polyvictimization. More is worse. That's not a surprise. Add the coefficients, right? Okay. The thing is that these studies and this conceptualization fails to distinguish effects of polyvictimization from aggregated single victimizations. Right? So if they're only additive, we can just add up effects from single victimization studies. We don't need this. Sorry to repeat myself. Okay. So if only cumulative effects are of interest, we can add them together, right? Combined effect is X effect plus Y effect. Okay. In the long run, we don't need it. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. Okay. That is to say, the whole of victimization is simply the sum of its parts. Do we really believe that? I kind of don't. Okay. But if that's true, we need to be explicit about it in our conceptualization and in hypothesizing and in our empirical approaches. Okay. Now, Finkelhor, to his credit, I mean, sort of implies non-additivity when he says that polyvictimization may have larger impact than high frequency single victimization. He means, okay, you follow me. All right. This argument is in a sense premised on the law of diminishing marginal returns. Okay. It means, okay, you were hit 5 times in the last week. The 6th time might not have as much added effect as being neglected once. Okay. But what we argue in this paper is that that's not what we should be paying attention to, that there's some sort of leveling off effect. What we should be looking for are not diminishing marginal effects, but explosive combinations of victimization. And this would come if you're thinking about different components of victimization as being necessary and sufficient causes for something. Okay, in this case, intergenerational transmission of trauma. If you think about what it would mean for conditions to be necessary and sufficient, what you've got is an interaction effect. A positive one when you're looking at negative stuff. Okay. So we call this the multiplicative hypothesis. So it's not just non-additivity, it's a particular kind of non-additivity, okay? On what basis would we predict multiplicative effects, okay? We would be better off considering whether the sort of a bruise is a bruise is a bruise, apologies to Gertrude Stein, approach is really serving us, okay? Consider two realistic hypotheticals, Jimmy and Cholsu, okay? Cholsu, sorry, if you're Korean, yeah, you're going to get me, okay? Cholsu is a Korean name, all right. So, Jimmy and Cholsu present with identical symptoms. 3 bruises across the back of the legs as a result of being hit by a stick with their dads. Okay. Now, if you're a social worker or someone doing, simple survey, quantitative research on violence, okay, what do you look at? Well, you got 3 bruises, you got hit with a stick. This is the same thing, right? They have identical physical victimization. We call it physical abuse. All right. But Jimmy was bruised when he failed to bring home cigarettes for his dad as requested. He gets home, says, Dad's sitting on the porch, sitting on the sofa watching a football game. Okay. Dad says, Jimmy, you bring me my ciggies? Okay. Jimmy says, no, Dad, I'm 12. They're not going to sell me cigarettes. Dad jumps up, says, what? Chases Jimmy around the room with a stick. Okay. Catches Jimmy 3 times across the back of the legs. Right. Charsu gets home. Dad's sitting on the couch watching soccer or football, depending on your context. Okay. Dad says, how did you do on your math test, Charsu? Charsu says, Dad, I'm really sorry. I got a C. Okay. Dad says, you know what happens when you get a C? You know what happens when you don't get an A? Stand against the wall. Okay. Pull up your trousers. Dad takes a stick, whacks Jimmy across the back of the legs 3 times. Okay. Now, both of those things are physical abuse. Exactly the same empiricals, right? Do you think that the effect on Jimmy and Charsu is the same? I'm really asking you this question. Do you? I see some shaking of heads, some pondering, some incommitment. Okay, my point is this. If you're Jimmy looking back at your childhood, you're looking back at what your dad did to you. You know you were physically abused. Why? If you're Jimmy, you're having a really hard time understanding that in any positive light at all, because this was all about what your dad wanted and his addiction, to cigarettes. Okay? If you're Chosu, you're looking back on this, and maybe you can look back on this, maybe not, depending on the rest of the context, but you can look back on this as well. My dad really wanted me to succeed. He was screwed up, he abused me, but he did care about me. And that can have a profoundly different effect on the trajectory of Jimmy and Chosu. So the implication is maybe our empirically driven types of victimization actually obscure and distort its most important aspects. And what I argue is we need victims' subjective voices to inform the development of new typologies. Okay? In other words, maybe it's not all stuff on the surface that we can just see like bruises or define. Maybe I love this sort of thinking, like maybe everything you know is wrong. It's sort of my paranoia creeping in there, right? What if we don't have the right types at all? What if like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, these are all empirically driven types. It's all about the medium. Well, is that really what it's about? Do we really have the right types of victimization and trauma when we look at it? Right? And if we don't have the right types, we're not going to be able to study multiplicative effects like we should effectively. And this is important because if 2 things combine to explode in terms of suicidal ideation and depression, this can literally kill people. We have to do something about it. It's not like, okay, I realize this is sociology kind of focus and it's mine too, but at the end of the day, we need to stop people from dying. Yeah? All right. So to study the multiplicative hypothesis accurately, we need to have the correct types in the first place. Okay? What types do we have? We already talked about it. Okay? There's a lot of research on types, but it's almost all or entirely all reducing to chronicity, severity, and it's all based on, coming from neglect, physical, sexual abuse. In other words, all the research looks like this. Okay? So I have to move faster. What we argue, first, we need to construct new types. Okay, then look for empirical regularities. Okay. Right. So this is the theory. Okay. We're going to look at new types: invasiveness, exploitativeness, and severity of victimization and trauma, right? And we are going to, so invasiveness is related to the medical definition of an invasive procedure. This kind of roots in why we think sexual abuse is bad. Okay, why is sexual abuse bad? It's invasive physically. Okay. Force feeding, Munchausen's by proxy, sexual abuse. Okay. Sexual abuse and other things like it are bad because they're exploitative. You're being used. Okay. So, examples. Apologies, I'm really rushing now because I'm ambitious in my presentation as well as in my theorization. Okay. So, the third aspect or dimension is severity. So, the argument here is we should say a three-way multiplicative interaction effect between invasiveness, exploitativeness, and severity. Okay. So this is a new theory. It's never been tested before in a large sample. Okay. We expect a main effect of invasiveness invasiveness of mother's childhood polyvictimization on adolescent depression symptoms and suicidal ideation. Main effect of exploitativeness of the mother's victimization on child's depression. Okay, main effect of the severity. Okay, but also we're thinking about, okay, the positive three-way interaction effect. Okay, we're also thinking about maternal depression symptoms. That's another mechanism we should control for because of genes. Okay. Also, complex PTSD is measured with an indicator of borderline personality features. Okay. And finally, abuse. Controlling for the mother's abuse of the child in terms of very severe abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse. Okay. So, why do this study in Nepal? Okay. 29 million people, 81% Hindu. It is geographically and culturally adjacent to India. Okay. For 81%, life is structured by caste. Okay. So the findings may generate insights for Nepal, definitely, but also potentially for South Asia. Okay. And there are high suicide and ideation and attempts in Nepal. Okay. Also, there's bias in our research. Okay. We tend to study powerful countries, powerful Western countries, powerful other countries. Okay. Powerful and wealthy countries. So we've got a stratified four-stage probability proportional size national sample of close to 1,100 Nepali mothers and their adolescent children. Okay. 100 wards. Let me get to the map so you can just see it. Okay. This is just the study ethics. This is a map of where we sampled. Okay. All right. Sorry to rush. Okay. These are our measures, which are, we can bring them up in the questions section. All right, because I want to get to the results. All right. So basically, pretty high levels of any depression symptoms. Okay. Also, about 1 in 4 are having suicidal ideation in the last week. Remember, these are adolescents. And then we've got some main effects, so basically the descriptives here. All right. There's plenty of victimization going on. All right. And just to highlight, okay, so here's our three-way interaction effect, and we do find a significant three-way interaction effect between invasiveness, exploitativeness, and severity of mother's childhood victimization in predicting the adolescent child's depression symptoms. Okay. In addition to which, we're controlling for the mother's depression, which is also significant. We're controlling for the mother's BPD symptoms, which we argue is an indicator for complex trauma. Okay. And we are controlling for very severe physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect of the adolescent child. Okay. So that's the most important, but there are other, the main effects were supported, right? So basically for depression, there's a main effect of invasiveness, and for suicidal ideation, there's a main effect of exploitativeness. Okay. But basically, the other mechanisms controlled, which were significant, there does seem to be this three-way effect, which is, for the first time, some support for this new theory. Okay, although we didn't control for PTSD. So that's going to be a problem and something we need to do in the next study. All right. Oops. Okay. So 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 supported for depression, 2 for suicidal ideation. Okay. In addition to the three-way effect that we talked about, which was positive and significant, there was a two-way positive interaction between the exploitativeness of the mother's victimization and the severity of it in predicting adolescent suicidal ideation. Okay. So the 3D theory, at least preliminarily, appears to be implicated in intergenerational effects of trauma on children's depression and suicidal ideation. Okay. We need to replicate it. We did hold constant the mother's depression, BPD features, and maltreatment of the adolescent, but we also need to hold constant the mother's PTSD. Okay. We controlled for the usual suspects. We need more research to look at whether or not this is operating via self-concept or something else, okay, specifically. And we need to control for PTSD and see PTSD better, complex PTSD better. But we should be concerned. Invasiveness and exploitativeness, particularly exploitativeness, may be a kind of toxic combination. Okay? And I'll add, we've been finding this in some smaller studies as well outside of Nepal. Okay. These are the usual suspects are also important risk factors. And basically, we need to triage better in terms of figuring out who's at highest risk for suicide and depression. Okay. We need further research, measure, development, and conceptual work to test the contributions. But okay, so like I'm all like happy, right? Because yay, I wrote this theory and it appears to generate something. But actually, even if my theory has, nothing. If I succeed in changing the way that we conceptualize victimization, right? So that we start thinking about, first of all, maybe what you see is not what you get. Okay. And secondly, we need to think multiplicatively in terms of toxic, explosive combinations of variables and dimensions instead of just, oh, look, main effects. Let's add up 30 risk factors. Okay. No, let's theorize a bit more rigorously. Okay. If I get people to do that, I will count this as a success. Okay. All right. Let me skip Joiner. Okay. Maybe we should stop looking for risk factors and start looking for multiplicative effects. Okay. If we're looking to save lives, we have to stop looking for ingredients and start looking for bombs. Okay, lots of limitations. The sample size is random and representative, but limited to Nepal. The measures of invasiveness and exploitativeness are very basic and require more development. I'll answer your questions later about what they are. Okay. They're measure problems. Okay. And the study is cross-sectional and based on maternal and adolescent self-report. Okay. Preliminary. Okay. And victimization rates are almost certainly under reports. So Nepali adolescents are very vulnerable to depression and suicidal ideation. Okay. This is related to the three-dimensional aspects of mother's childhood trauma. And the last refuge of the social science scoundrel is to call for more research. Okay. All righty. I think we need to consider new criteria for understanding mental health risks, from violence. Okay. Thank you.